All right, here we are on Chapter 8, the last chapter of a declassified document from the CIA Crest Library, and this is actually an NSA document within the CIA's documents. And the title of this is Cryptological Aspects of ESP, and this last chapter is Defense Against ESP, Chapter 8. It's only about 4 pages, but it has some interesting information in it, so while it'll be a short reading, there might be another 5 or 10 minutes of commentary added in between or at the end. Defense against ESP. As extrasensory perception does appear to pose a threat to U.S. communication security, it is of considerable concern to determine how defenses might be erected against such an attack. ESP is seen to be an effect of the empathetic bond. This has been firmly established in Soviets as well as a free world research. Kamansky, the Soviet, when transmitting to his receiver Nikolov, concentrated on being angry at him. Dr. Thelma Moss of UCLA uses emotionally charged films to stimulate feelings of threat in the transmitter. So we've jumped a couple. This document appears a few times declassified in the, which is to say there's multiple copies of it with different declassification numbers, I think 2 or 3 maybe. And sometimes there's pages missing from other ones, but this one I hope isn't missing anything, because then I have to start this, figure out how to intercede the other chapters. But we're supposed to have an understanding of Kamansky and Nikolov, and it also, the way it starts off, it's like, well, now we agree with the Soviets, and now everything we accept everything, and here's where we are now. So that, just reposition your mind now where they're not being skeptical. They're basically saying it's all real, and we have to move forward with XXX. So Dr. Thelma Moss of UCLA uses emotionally charged films to stimulate feelings of threat in the transmitter. That's like Clockwork Orange, right? In the E. Douglas Dean experiments at Newark, the transmitter concentrated on people that Dean either greatly disliked or cared about. So there again we have 2 other institutions or locations, UCLA and Newark, involved in it. Although no known defense could be called foolproof against a talented psychic, it is evident from years of research and experience that anything which degrades the intensity of the bond between the perceiver and the object or person of concern is a defense against ESP. So your anger, you can make yourself a poor receiver or perceiver based on their words. But then remember that this is in the 60s when this was written, and we have documents, of course, over here all the way up into the 80s. Later on, we'll see that things were, in fact, invented and devised to defend against it from a technical means. As noted in Chapter 6, the test scenes declined when the 2 subjects began to dislike each other and become bored with the tests. For many years, researchers have complained about the decline factor, which is in most tests is caused by the tedium of doing the same thing over and over again in a boring manner. While mild doses of drugs and alcohol seem to enhance the ESP factor in some perceivers, heavy drugs or alcohol has a destructive effect on ESP. So, it's the same adage, same old rule, in moderation, everything in moderation. I will say too, though, however, that those are a defense against it too. If you feel like you're being watched, or you're one of those people who have good sensory input, and as I mentioned, I think in Chapter 5 or 4, where you have, you're able to recognize that 1,000-yard stare in a crowd, or in my experience, I would know when the camera feed was just kind of got on me right away. It's as much a defense mechanism if you're a fast thinker and able to both change your thoughts quickly and adapt quickly, as well as what I would call, and what I believe to be a psychological interview for this stuff for myself, what I actually defined as the drunken monkey technique, the drunken master, which is, if you've ever watched any of the old kung fu movies, I always found the drunken master most appealing because it was like you never knew what they were going to do, but they always survived. Whether or not they won or not, it didn't matter. They just survived and kept going. A lot of times they would win. Most of the times they would get away. And of course, they were drunk all the time. They would drink a lot. So while they're saying that it would make an active, an agent work poorly in the field, at the same time, it's a protection mechanism too, for those of us who maybe don't have any real training in how to recognize when someone's performing it, or we're being monitored or reviewed, and as well as just social situations where you just have to be quick on your feet and improvise and survive, because there are a lot of people who are just smarter than one of us. There's always someone better. That's just the way it works, and you have to be able to scale that challenge and improvise. Be the drunken master when you have to be the drunken master. And that doesn't mean go ahead and drink. I'm just saying, apply that process of being able to change your thoughts quickly, or another method for me was to, and I still do it now, is I tend to work on 3 or 4 projects, or whatever I want to do. I don't just do one thing. I do get focused, and I will really hash something out when I need to, but it's always been more beneficial for me to also kind of jump around to something else that will completely immerse me as well. And through that, I get a little bit of clarity on what else on the previous thing I was working on. And it's not sporadic or empathetic, and as they say, boredom. It's just a mechanism which I've grown up with and honed myself, if you want to call that ADD or whatever. Those terms are real. In the scope of all this knowledge now, right? Those terms don't mean jack shit anymore. They don't mean anything. They're just more ways to pump jugs into people. And if you're, possibly becoming a new parent, or you're an existing parent, maybe this knowledge and this stuff will help you maybe reevaluate your understandings of your children or family members, and just sort of look at things a little bit more positively. And not, it's like, I've just always had this notion that doctors just seem to believe in the absolute, whatever's happening now is the, let's say, how do I word this? It's always funny that everything's a disease or a virus, but they never look at it as like an evolving human still. So when they say someone has 6 fingers, this or that, or this thing emerged and it's called a mutation, we gotta remove it. It's just like this belief that we're at exactly where we need to be, and anything else that occurs within the human body is a mistake. So ADD or bipolar, all these psychosomatic and kind of new emerging ways to our autism, right? There are some publications that say everyone's autistic now. Everybody, doesn't matter who you are, you fall on a spectrum of autism, and that's just not realistic. I mean, it's just a label, and it's a way to qualify something you don't know or you don't understand, and it's for the now and in the moment, but it does the long-term effects of using those labels on people and giving them the drugs and treatment related to that stuff. Not to say that you shouldn't, and not to say that people don't have serious conditions, because they do, but we have to kind of soften our view and our perspective a little bit, and not focus so intently on ailments as diseases and viruses, or effects and side effects and adverse effects as diseases or viruses. And I think that's all this research has led me to think that, and I think it's worth at least exploring a little bit. Even, people call them certain, neuroscientists, and people who say right brain, left brain, they use all this typical language as if they're a doctor themselves, and it's just, Doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't make a lot of sense. All right, so let's start as a note in chapter 6. Sorry about that little tangent there. For many years, researchers have complained about the decline factor, which, as in most tests, is caused by the tedium of doing the same thing over and over again in a boring manner. While mild doses of drugs and alcohol seem to enhance the ESP factor, in some perceivers, heavy drugs of alcohol has a destructive effect. We know that. And that could be said for anything, like I said. Everything in moderation. Research has consistently indicated that a distracted, calm, on-dreamy state is good for reception of ESP material, but is poor for transmission. That's interesting. A state of confusion in the subject, especially when engendered in a skeptical environment, has always been observed to hinder the PSI factor. A state of confusion in the subject, especially when engendered in a skeptical environment. That's like chaos magic. That's what anybody from the occult would call chaos magic, where you're just not sure what's going on. I don't know why they would use engendered, unless this is, this is one of those documents where it's coded and the person who reads it the right way recognizes this is actually not meant to be for the benefit. It's meant to isolate everybody and suppress. Where negative ionization of a mild nature seem to enhance perception, positive ionized atmosphere inhibits and makes a person nervous and depressed. While intense concentration is good for transmitting telepathically, it is poor for reception. It is a poor condition for reception. So hold on to that line. When negative ionization, positive ionization, those are, in my recall, probably the past 10 years, we've had a lot of those types of fans and air filters and air conditioning units and all these mechanisms that pump negative and positive ionized atmosphere. I've also worked in corporate environments enough to where I would move from environment to environment as a contractor or a freelancer, and they employ these technologies in their agency environment, even down to keeping the room a certain temperature. And it was originally, when I brought it up, and I made sure to bring it up as I moved from agency to agency with someone who I thought would be able to answer my question, but just casually. They give these great answers. It's for the smell. We don't, because everybody's so different. Some people wear deodorant, some people don't. Some people have bad breath, and we have a white noise filter so that you can't hear what the person down the hall is saying and all that kind of stuff. And that's true, but that's also security related as well. And the way they would run these things, I actually, again, another memory comes forward. Working as a contractor at in an agency in New York called Sudler Hennessy, who I'm almost positive were employing these technologies, and it's a terrible memory, but I actually had someone come up to me and tell me to sit up in my chair, and here I am at I'm working, 4 or 5 days until about midnight every night. And I just had to get in and try to, at the same time as sitting at the computer, I had to just kind of meditate on what was actually happening so I could try to solve the problem. And it later occurred to me that the monitors were monitoring us, and that some screens are designed to work as large MRI devices and things like that. But I remember saying that. Or I remember my immediate boss saying that to me as he walked by, and I just I was in a group, in a huddle, so there was multiple people surrounding me, and they were all working at their computers as well. And I just said out loud, I said, "Did my boss just tell me to sit up straight?" And everyone's like, "Mm-hmm." And I didn't register. I mean, for one, they all recognized that obviously that was pretty odd, because we all, someone sits cross-legged in their chair, someone's leaning off of it half sideways, and Some people get up every 15 minutes, and I mean, there's really no reason for someone to come by and say something like that to anybody. And little did I know that these experiments are run internally and many organizations and agencies. So, what paragraph? What are we at? 4 times? Okay, here we go. So the last one. While intense concentration is good for transmitting telepathically, it is a poor condition for reception. From time immemorial, it has been reported that enclosing oneself deep within one who is a very strong protection against such attacks of perception. So we're missing the asterisks. Okay, that's funny. I'm just going to skip this page and go to the asterisk because I wanted to know what that meant right here. The one who is. The real absolute relationship, the one life, as experienced by deep individuals and contemplative groups targeting the pure substance of reality. This is the foundation entity, the primary existence. So this to me, I mean, when I read this reminds me of the Steiner method, right? The Waldorf method and Rudolf Steiner. This literally sounds exactly like Steiner. And I think I mentioned in maybe video 2 or 3 that research would go back to the 30s and often the early 1900s, 1800s, and 1700s, even as far back, that at the end of the 1800s and the 1900s, the Waldorf method emerged, which was I'm going to paraphrase it all, not to belittle these people, because what they did was fairly profound, but just to keep this brief and consistent and concurrent. Because so many parents and people were working in factories, oftentimes children would have to go with the parents to the factory, and then they developed a method for sort of tutoring and keeping the kids busy with scholastics, various types of school and stuff, and that eventually turned into what was known as the Waldorf method. And that was also predicated on some really spiritual and intellectual research that Rudolf Steiner was doing concerning raising children, and most of that always involves the spiritual component. I mean, the entire curriculum was wrapped around the spiritual component, the religious component, and the the arts and learning by doing and things like that. And it wasn't this rigid system that we have now where you're just kind of hour to hour shuffling around and really kind of not getting to apply anything you're doing other than going out to PE, or fitness, physical fitness education. But that's what this sounds like. So when we look at the date of these documents and we consider how old these researchers might have been, it's most likely that they themselves were raised on this literature and this kind of available material. When they were in their teens, whatever their parents or schools introduced to them was most likely predicated on the Waldorf, Frankfurt, or Steiner methods, and those were pretty popular, or even the Montessori method to some degree. So back to reading, next paragraph. The above defenses are principally passive, but there are reports from primitive people and more sophisticated psychics that active measures can be used to confuse the mind of another. Well, there you go, confusion. So there's chaos magic, right? The British report, and now we've got the British reports some curious case of malignant ESP where natives in the Pacific Islands were targeted for death by the tribe and didn't know it at the time, but they still died with no apparent cause of death discovered. Wolf Messing and psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain is reported to be able to cloud men's minds and even convince them that he is someone else. Well, there you go. I mean, imagine what can be done now if this research exists. Reportedly, the Soviets tested him early in the Second World War period. On one occasion, Messing walked through Stalin's guards without being challenged. He says he made them think he was Beria, the chief of secret police. On another occasion, he bemused a bank clerk into giving him a large sum of money. All apparent ESP defensive measures require careful scientific scrutiny to determine their degree of reality and usability. Okay, so this is the last page. Uncareful use of either offensive or defensive psychic powers is exceedingly dangerous. The fanatical Hitler experience, where a society of criminal leadership thrust open an occult horror, horror chamber which costs over 50 million dead, should be more than a casual reminder that opening the Pandora's box, Hitler's always used, right? And if you're reading this, you probably have questions about Hitler or have done some pretty thorough research into Hitler, but I would do that. Especially since you're referencing German research to begin with. And you're, at this time, many of your operatives and agents are trained by scientists and inventors from the German community. We must proceed with caution and integrity. It is my conviction that only the whole man can successfully survive in this new world. This is the last frontier and the most challenging. Man needs all of his powers and experience to be equal to the task. He must bring his wisdom as well as his science, his emotion as well as his mind. And unless the man is firmly rooted in the foundation of the spirit of life, he will not survive this great adventure into the world of being. And that's a pronoun, being. So let me step back. So this clouding men's minds, and so this can actually be done with technology, and it's just disrupting the theta waves. But he made them think he was Beria, the chief of secret police. He bemused a bank clerk into giving him a large sum of money. So that's interesting because we have the terms charismatic and charming. Both start with CHAR, and one is based off of the charisma. And the charisma is a religious and esoteric reference to the chrism. And the chrism is a religious and esoteric reference to the Christic. And the Christic, of course, is the Christ, the Christ consciousness. So that's in my language studies, my English arts, excuse me, sorry guys, late. English arts, it's clear to me that those are derivatives of one another, and just further sort of, I guess, positions this knowledge as really old, very old. And with that said, and to close this up, the fact that now these people act like they've discovered it or found out about it, and then in turn are basically saying you can't, if the lid is lifted, it will not be closed. Little do they know it's been open the whole time, right? I mean, little do they know that you didn't discover it. And if people can do it and you're a religious person, it stands to reason that it would be a God-given gift to begin with. So I think when we really put religious and esoteric texts into the forefront of this, at least next to it, especially Egyptian texts, we recognize that even they recognized, look, first of all, you're not going to be able to do it well if you're not a balanced person. If you're an unbalanced person, it really won't work well to begin with. So there's no reason we don't need to regulate it in that way. In fact, there wasn't a lot of regulation of it to begin with. It was a very common thing, and those who did ascend to become ascended masters, probably like Christ, or rather Jesus, and Buddha, Dharma, who knows? I think there's been lots of people who have been ascended masters And apparently there were communities who were ascended masters and they were basically destroyed by technology. But it's a shame that people, I guess, think it's their right to limit the rights of others for the betterment of others, when, as far as I can understand it, there's no mass belief system. It's just not. And if it ever got that far to a mass belief system, it would probably be a very sad place, because, I mean, I'll use a quote from a much more intelligent person, but I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said, "If everyone thinks alike, then no one's really thinking." And I don't think we really want it to get to that point. No one does. So, let the lid up, lift the lid. It should be lifted. Everyone should have their own choice. If parents are responsible, make parents responsible for their children and their upbringing, and from there you have the law. And if what I think is actually occurring is happening, whereby everyone's being suppressed, or if anybody exhibits it, or even if people who don't exhibit it, I mean, I could look at these things like persuading people. We call it persuasion, psychological. There's many other ways to deceive people and make it look like it's psychic ability. There's just as much that avenue. It's like the trick works both directions. Many people could just by reading all this literature, get it all down pat, go in and use their own tricks, and just say, well, I'm telepathic, or I have ESP, and then boom, the psychic police show up and say, we're going to hit you with our little microwave ray and do all this stuff to you. And we have to, if this person's warning us about the lid being opened, I'm warning us about those who should be controlling whether or not it gets opened, right? The watchers and the watching and all that other stuff. All right, so this is the end of this document. If I find other parts of it, I apologize if I don't remember how far this one is, but I think this is the final page here, the final piece of this document. But we're at the end of it, so this closes off cryptological aspects of ESP, and we're going to get into some other documents later. I'll probably pump out some other videos related to the English language arts as well in the next couple of days, some stuff that I've just learned and kind of recompiled and reorganized into 2-year-old research that I've been doing. All right, have a good night.